The Devil's Demeanor, written and read by Jerry Hart. Part 1. Chapter 1. The moment Donovan Scott heard the news, he knew the time had come. When he finally arrived at Ivy's house, he found it surrounded by cops. It was 10 o'clock in the evening, but the whole street had come out to see what was going on. Don parked as close as he could and made his way through the police and paramedics, telling them he was related to the Petersons and that he'd been called here. The man in charge, the one who had called, waved him in. "I'm Detective Bushnell. It's a real mess in there," the portly detective informed Don. "Be prepared." That was all the warning he got. He hadn't even been told who had died. He stepped into the house, which brought him directly into the living room. If he'd had a weaker stomach, he'd be emptying it at that very moment. Who knew the human body held that much blood? There was some on the walls, but the majority was pooled on the floor under the victim's head. The victim, Ivy's boyfriend, was missing his face. It looked like it had been completely ripped off. There was no doubt that Connor had done this. Connor was only 5 years old. Looking around the small living room, Don noticed his nephew wasn't there. Only Ivy, who sat on the couch, her hands cuffed behind her back, her clothes covered in drying gore. That was unexpected. "Ivy," Don called. She was surrounded by cops, and they stopped him. "What's going on here?" he asked. The detective pulled him into the adjoining kitchen and said, "Miss Peterson is suspected of murdering her boyfriend." He nodded to the body on the floor, which was finally being covered up with a sheet. "Ivy didn't do this," Don said with certainty, though he quickly regretted it. "What makes you say that, Mr. Scott?" There was no way Don could tell him that he suspected his 5-year-old nephew of the hideous crime. But there was also no way Don could let Ivy take responsibility, not if she was innocent. To cover up his comment, Don said, "That couldn't have been done by a human being. Looks more like the work of an animal." The detective, satisfied with the response, said, "We figured the same thing, but we found tissue samples under her fingernails. Plus," he added, taking a breath, "she confessed." Don nodded slowly. He didn't doubt that she would take the fall for her child. He stared at Ivy, sitting on that couch. Her face was blank, her eyes glossy and empty. She had seen what Connor was capable of. She would never forget it. "Where is the boy?" Don asked the detective. Don walked into Connor's room and saw an officer sitting on the little bed. A little dark-haired boy sat next to her, dressed in clothes that were not covered in blood. Both the boy and the cop held action figures in their hands. "I'm his uncle," Don said to her. "How is he?" "He hasn't said a word since we found him." "Do you think he saw what happened?" "I know he did." She nodded to something in a corner of the room. "We found him in that." Don saw a shirt and pants on the floor, covered in dried blood. He stared at the mess for longer than he wished to. Anger boiled up inside of him, anger at the curse that had been passed down to his brother's son. Don had hoped it was over, that the next generation of Scotts would be spared. But the demon was dead. How was it still affecting them? "Can I talk to him alone for a minute?" Don asked the officer. She nodded, put down the action figure, and closed the door behind her. For a moment, Don only stood there, as far away from his nephew as the room allowed. Connor stared at his action figure, but didn't play with it. Many thoughts ran through Don's mind, thoughts about what he should do with the boy. Ivy had named Don Godfather years ago, and he had gladly accepted. Now, though, Now, all he wanted to do was destroy Connor. Now that the boy had killed, he would turn into a monster the way Ethan had. The way Mom had. Did the curse have Connor now? The monster that started it in the first place was dead. It couldn't abduct Connor now and teach him to become a killing machine the way it had done to Ethan. The moment Don realized this, he suddenly felt hope. If he adopted Connor, he could raise the boy right, maybe even keep the curse at bay. He kneeled down in front of Connor and said, "I know what you did, but it's okay. It wasn't your fault. I'm going to take care of you, okay?" Connor finally looked up and smiled.